They checked her ID, questioned whether she was really who she said she was, and called security, all before realizing they were about to turn away the one person who could end their careers in an instant. The thought had been in the back of her mind for months. It started as a quiet idea, easy to ignore. But the more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. Hannah Roberts built Roberts Trust from scratch, her bank, her legacy. She wasn't just another CEO sitting in a glass office with a city view. She had spent years making sure her bank was different, more accessible, and based on fairness. But was it really that? That's the question that kept her up at night. She had heard rumors before, concerns about how certain clients were treated at different branches. Nothing obvious, nothing that would make headlines. Just a feeling, stories from people she trusted. At first, she brushed them off. After all, her bank had strict policies about fair treatment and anti-discrimination. But policies are just words on paper. Real change comes from actions. And Hannah needed proof. She needed to know not as a CEO, not as a boss, but as a customer. So today she was just another woman walking into a bank, no expensive blazer, no silk blouse, no designer shoes, just a simple cardigan, jeans, and sneakers. She parked in front of a Roberts Trust branch in St. Louis, Missouri, a location she had personally approved 3 years ago. Back then, she had shaken hands with the branch manager, posed for photos, and delivered a speech about how trust was the foundation of good banking. Now she was walking in as a nobody. The doors opened automatically, and the air smelled of fresh paper and industrial air freshener. It was a quiet afternoon. Only a few customers stood in line, and a couple sat in the waiting area. A teller at the far end was counting cash. Hannah adjusted her bag and walked up to the counter. The teller, a young woman in her 20s with dark hair tied into a ponytail, glanced up briefly, giving her no greeting, no smile, just a quick glance before returning her attention to the screen. Hannah cleared her throat. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said. The teller didn't look up but slid a clipboard toward her. "Fill this out," she said. The form was standard: name, account number, withdrawal amount, nothing out of the ordinary. Hannah took a pen from her bag and filled in the details. $5,000. Not a huge sum, but enough for them to verify her ID. She slid the clipboard back to the teller. That's when things changed. The teller's eyes flicked to the form and then to Hannah's ID. Her expression tightened. Something felt off. There was a shift in the air, a hesitation that hadn't been there a moment before. Hannah waited, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. The teller looked up again, this time actually studying her face. She hesitated for just a beat too long. In that instant, Hannah realized it wasn't about the withdrawal. It wasn't about bank policy. It wasn't about security. It was about who they thought she was. The teller hovered over the keyboard, then, as if making a decision, placed Hannah's ID on the counter. I'll be right back," she said. Hannah's eyes narrowed. The teller grabbed the ID and walked away, disappearing behind the door to the manager's office. Hannah exhaled, tapping her nails on the marble counter. She had expected to be treated differently, but not like this. She knew this was just the beginning, though. She wasn't leaving, not until she got answers. She leaned against the counter, watching the teller walk away. The tension in the lobby seemed to grow thicker. She looked around. There was a man in business attire, 2 spots behind her, waiting his turn. His suit was a little wrinkled, his tie loosened, as if he had come straight from work. When he stepped up, the teller greeted him immediately. Another woman, older in a floral dress, was talking easily with a different teller across the room. No hesitation, no extra scrutiny. Hannah turned back to the counter, her jaw tightening. She had been standing there for nearly 5 minutes, waiting for an explanation, for something that shouldn't even be happening. But she knew what was going on. This wasn't about policy. If it were, the teller would have explained. She wouldn't have walked off without a word. This was different. Finally, the door opened and the teller reappeared, this time with someone else, a middle-aged man, stocky build, bald, with glasses. His name tag read, Todd Larson. He looked polite, but his expression was too controlled. He wasn't walking toward her like someone who wanted to help. He was assessing her, and Hannah recognized that look. She had seen it before, but never directed at her. Todd stopped at the counter, gave her a tight-lipped smile, and said, "Afternoon, ma'am. I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal." Hannah nodded once. "That's right. $5,000 from my account. Here's my ID." Todd glanced at the teller, then back at her. "Mind if I take a quick look at your ID again?" Hannah kept her voice steady. "I already gave it to her." Todd didn't acknowledge her comment. He picked up her ID, holding it up to the light and studying it before glancing back at her. "Miss Roberts, is this your first time banking with us?" Hannah's stomach dropped. The question sounded so carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. "Do you even belong here?" Her voice sharpened. "I've banked here since this branch opened." Todd gave a slow, exaggerated nod as if he was processing the information. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? Hannah felt her patience thinning. "That's what I wrote down." The lobby had quieted, not completely silent, but quieter. A few customers had noticed the shift in energy and glanced her way. Todd turned the ID over in his fingers, then, without even looking at her, asked, "What do you do for work, Miss Roberts?" Hannah let out a short laugh, more from disbelief than amusement. There it was, the moment when professionalism slipped just enough to reveal the truth. She tilted her head, studying him. "I'm in finance," she replied carefully. Todd's smile was forced. "Oh, what kind?" Hannah let the silence stretch before answering. "Banking." That made him pause for a second, but instead of backing off, he pressed on. "I see," he said slowly. "And this is a personal account, not a business one?" Hannah folded her arms. "That's what it says on the form." Another slow nod from Todd, another glance at the teller, and more hesitation. Finally, as if deciding something, he placed the ID back on the counter. "Unfortunately, we won't be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Hannah blinked, trying to process his words. "What?" She straightened. "Excuse me?" Todd's expression remained calm and controlled. "We're unable to verify the transaction." Hannah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? You have my ID? You have my account number? What's there to verify?" Todd clasped his hands in front of him. "It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously." Security, she thought. The word often used when they didn't want to say what they really meant. Her fingers clenched against her palms. This wasn't about fraud or banking procedures. This was about something else entirely. But she wasn't leaving. Not now. Not without an explanation. Todd wasn't done. He had one more thing to add, and when he did, Hannah knew things were about to get worse. "We're unable to verify the transaction." Her gaze flicked between Todd and the teller, waiting, hoping they would fix this, realize their mistake, and let her walk out without another word. But neither of them moved. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the counter. "Todd," she said, her voice steady but firm, "what exactly needs to be verified?" Todd kept his hands clasped, expression neutral, too neutral. "Well, Miss Roberts, large cash withdrawals require extra security steps. We just need to confirm a few details before proceeding." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Todd hesitated for a split second before answering. "Just some basic account verification. Can you tell me the last deposit amount made to this account?" Hannah stared at him. That wasn't standard procedure. Sure, security questions were normal, but not for a withdrawal with a valid ID. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The unspoken challenge. Was this a test? Was it a way to make her prove she had access to her own money? Her fingers curled against the marble countertop. I don't have that number memorized, she said evenly, but if you pull up my account like you would for anyone else, you can see all my deposits. Todd gave her a thin smile. Of course, but for security reasons, we need to make sure the account holder can confirm certain details first. Hannah's jaw tightened. I just gave you my ID. Todd didn't flinch. I understand, but you'd be surprised how often fraudulent IDs come through. Fraudulent. She took a slow breath. I'm not withdrawing millions. It's $5,000. A fraction of what I have in this account. I've already followed the protocol, so let me ask again. What's the real issue here? Todd's expression didn't change. We're just doing our due diligence, Miss Roberts. Her patience was wearing thin. Todd, she said, her voice measured, if I were a man in a tailored suit, would you be asking me these questions? The words landed. A flicker of something crossed his face, too quick to catch, but it was there. A subtle shift in posture, a tightening around his eyes. Then just as quickly his professional mask returned. This isn't about appearance, he said smoothly. It's about policy. Hannah let out a short, humorless laugh. Is that right? Todd tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words carefully. Would you like to try using a different form of verification? He offered. Perhaps a utility bill, a second form of ID. A utility bill? Hannah couldn't help herself. She let out a disbelieving breath. You want me to provide a second form of ID for my own bank account where you're currently holding my money? Todd didn't blink. Hannah shook her head, tapping her nails against the counter. Okay, let's do this another way. Pull up my account. Todd hesitated. You have my name? She continued. You have my ID. If you check my file, you'll see that I've been banking here since day one, that I helped open this branch. I probably signed off on some of your training materials, Hannah said, leaning in slightly and lowering her voice just enough to make her point clear. You might want to check before you make this worse. Todd pressed his lips together, and the teller, who had been quietly observing, shifted uncomfortably. For a brief moment, Hannah wondered if Todd would finally give in, if he would apologize, backtrack, and handle the situation the way it should have been handled from the start. Instead, Todd exhaled, as if reluctantly reaching a decision. I'm sorry, Miss Roberts, he said smoothly. Without additional verification, we can't process this withdrawal today. Hannah felt a rush of anger rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from sheer frustration. She could feel the eyes of the nearby customers on her, subtle glances flicking her way as they sensed the tension but pretended not to notice. She could hear the cold politeness in Todd's voice. He wasn't worried about security at all. He had already decided she wasn't supposed to be here, and nothing she said was going to change that. But Todd had made a critical mistake. If he had simply processed the transaction, this would have ended here. Now Hannah was going to make him regret it. Before she could say another word, Todd did something that sent a fresh wave of disbelief through her, something that turned this from frustrating to infuriating. Danielle barely had time to react before Todd did the unthinkable. He reached under the counter, pressed a discreet button near the register, and called over security. A tall, uniformed guard with broad shoulders stepped out from a back office. His face was unreadable, but Hannah knew what this looked like. A bank manager refusing to process a customer's request was one thing, but calling security over was something else entirely. It was a statement. It was an escalation, and it made her stomach tighten. Hannah let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had dealt with men like Todd before, the ones who didn't expect resistance, the ones who made it their mission to remind certain people of their place. But she wasn't playing along. She lifted her chin slightly and locked eyes with Todd. You're really doing this? Todd gave a neutral expression. We just want to ensure a smooth experience for all our customers. A smooth experience? Hannah shot back, her voice cool. Are you here to help me access my money or just escort me out? The security guard hesitated, glancing at Todd, who gave a tight nod. Hannah let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Wow, so this is how it's going to be? Todd sighed as if he was the one being inconvenienced. Miss Roberts, if you'd like to return with additional documentation, we'd be happy to assist you. But right now, we can't. Hannah cut him off. You know what's funny, Todd? I watched you process that man's transaction 10 minutes ago. No extra verification, no manager intervention, no security. Todd's expression stiffened, but Hannah stepped closer to the counter, her voice lowering. I wonder what's different about me. The room shifted. The teller avoided eye contact, and the security guard shifted on his feet, his stance less rigid. Todd, however, remained firm. I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Roberts, he said, his voice flat, but our policies are in place for a reason. Hannah held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached into her bag. Todd stiffened, and the security guard's hand inched closer to his belt. Hannah didn't blink. She pulled out her phone and began recording. A few customers looked over, sensing something was happening. Todd's posture shifted. Miss Roberts, he said, I just want to make sure I get this on record. You're refusing to allow me access to my own account, she said smoothly. Despite providing government-issued identification, while other customers aren't being asked to provide anything extra. Todd's jaw tensed. Danielle turned slightly, angling the camera toward the security guard. And you were called over for what reason exactly? The guard hesitated, glancing at Todd. Danielle didn't move. She didn't look away. She didn't give them a chance to control the moment. A thick silence settled over the room. Then Todd made one final mistake. He reached out, not to grab her, not to push her phone away, but to snatch her ID off the counter. As if, despite everything, he still needed to have the last move. But that was it. That was the moment. Hannah smiled because Todd had no idea who he was dealing with. In about 10 seconds, he was going to wish he had handled this differently. She let the moment stretch, making Todd feel the weight of his mistake. He had grabbed her ID as if he had the authority to decide what happened next, as if this was his bank. But it wasn't. It was hers. Hannah tilted her phone slightly, making sure the camera captured his face, the security guard, and the tension hanging in the air. Then, in the calmest voice possible, she said, Todd, let me introduce myself properly. His expression twitched, the first sign of real uncertainty. Hannah reached for her ID, plucking it from his grip with deliberate ease. She flipped it over in her hand, tapping her finger against the name printed on it. You see this? This isn't just any customer's ID. Hannah paused, letting her words sink in. You're looking at the founder and CEO of Roberts Trust. The silence in the bank lobby was instant. The security guard shifted his posture. The teller's face drained of color. Even the customers nearby, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, stiffened. Todd lost control for the first time since this whole interaction began. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His lips parted as if he was about to say something, but no words came out. Hannah took a slow step back, slipping her ID into her bag. I built this bank from nothing, she continued. I signed off on the approval for this branch. I personally approved the hiring budget that got you this job. Todd's hands curled into fists. His entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the forced politeness. What remained was pure panic. Hannah gave him a tight-lipped smile. And today I walked in as just another customer, just to see what would happen. She tilted her head slightly. You know what happened, Todd. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Hannah let her voice lower just a bit. I was refused service, lied to, humiliated, and treated like I didn't belong. Todd blinked, finally opening his mouth. Miss Roberts, Hannah held up a hand. Number, you had your chance to speak. Now you listen. She turned slightly, making sure everyone in the lobby could hear her next words. If I were standing here in a tailored suit, if I were a man, if I looked like what you expect a CEO to look like, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. Todd's eyes darted to the security guard as if looking for help. The guard said nothing. The teller was staring at the register, looking like she wanted to disappear. Hannah took a slow breath, pulling her phone back up. "Todd, I have a question for you," she said deadpan. "Would you like me to send this footage directly to corporate, or should I just handle this right now?" Todd visibly paled. His mouth opened and closed twice before he finally found his voice. "Miss Roberts, I sincerely apologize. This was just a misunderstanding." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" Todd nodded quickly. "Yes, absolutely. I can process that withdrawal right away." Hannah let that sit in the air for a second, then finally let out a soft laugh. "Todd," she said, shaking her head, "you and I both know it's too late for that." Todd's face went ashen because he knew she was right. What came next was up to her, but one thing was certain: his day was about to get a lot worse. Todd's face had lost every ounce of confidence. The smooth, polished manager who had so casually dismissed her just 5 minutes ago now stood rigid, his hands gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The security guard, who had been called over to handle her, now shifted awkwardly, glancing between Todd and Hannah as if silently asking, "Am I still supposed to be here?" Hannah exhaled slowly, tapping her nails against the counter. "Let me make sure I understand, Todd," she said, her voice measured. "Just a few minutes ago, my ID wasn't enough. My name wasn't enough. My account history wasn't enough. You needed more proof. You needed additional verification. And now that you know who I am," she let the pause linger, watching him squirm. "Suddenly, none of that matters anymore." Todd swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Miss Roberts, I sincerely regret how this situation unfolded. I can assure you this was not intentional." Hannah let out a humorless laugh. "Not intentional," she repeated. "Do you think I'm stupid?" His eyes widened slightly, but he stayed silent. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she continued, her voice calm but sharp. "You looked at me, and in your mind, you already decided I wasn't supposed to be here. You put up every roadblock you could to make sure I knew it." Todd shook his head quickly. "Miss Roberts, I assure you that's not what happened." Hannah held up a hand, cutting him off. "No," she said, her voice like steel. "I don't want to hear any more rehearsed apologies. Let's be clear. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." Todd's jaw tightened. The customers in the lobby were no longer pretending not to listen. The air felt charged, and the weight of the moment settled into everyone nearby. The teller who had started this whole mess stood frozen, staring at the register, refusing to look up. Hannah turned toward the security guard. "You were called over to escort me out, correct?" she asked. The guard hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, ma'am. That was my understanding." She nodded. "And now that you know who I am, are you still under that impression?" The guard glanced at Todd, then back at her. His stance shifted slightly. "No, ma'am. I was just following instructions." Hannah studied him for a moment. She knew how this worked. Todd would try to pass the blame on to everyone else. Pretend this was just an overreaction. Try to make it go away. But this wasn't going away. She reached for her bag and pulled out a business card. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, sliding it across the counter toward Todd. "You're going to call my office. You're going to schedule a meeting with corporate, and you're going to explain in detail why this happened today." Todd's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the card. "Of course, Miss Roberts, absolutely." Hannah turned to the security guard. "I appreciate you stepping in when called." She spoke evenly, but with a firm tone. "I'd advise you to be more careful about which situations actually require your involvement. If a customer isn't being disruptive, The first step shouldn't be intimidation? The guard gave a small nod. Understood, ma'am. She turned to the teller, who was still pretending not to exist. You, Hannah said, her voice calm but firm. The young woman flinched. Hannah leaned slightly over the counter. You saw my ID. You had my account information, and you still decided I wasn't worth listening to. The teller finally looked up, eyes wide. I was just following protocol, ma'am. Then maybe you need to ask yourself, Hannah said, her voice steady. Why does protocol only seem to apply to people like me? The teller swallowed hard, looking away. Hannah took one last look around the branch. Every customer in the room was watching. Every employee had heard. This wasn't about a withdrawal anymore. This was about something bigger. Hannah straightened her shoulders. She had made her point, but she wasn't done. Now she was going to make sure this never happened again. Hannah stepped away from the counter, her heels clicking against the polished tile as she made her way toward the exit. The silence in the bank was thick, almost suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Todd stood frozen, her business card still clutched in his fingers. The teller looked as if she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. The security guard, who had been so ready to escort her out, now looked uncomfortable and unsure. The customers had stopped pretending not to watch. Hannah paused at the door, then slowly turned back around. One last thing. She wasn't the type to let something like this slide. She had spent years building this bank. It was supposed to be a place where people felt safe, respected, and valued. But today, she had been reminded that policies on paper mean nothing if the people enforcing them don't believe in them. Hannah took a slow breath, scanning the room. Then, in a voice that was steady, clear, and impossible to ignore, she said, "This is the last time something like this happens in my bank." The weight of her words settled over the room. Todd flinched. The teller shifted in place. The security guard looked down. Hannah continued, "I won't stand by while customers are treated differently because of assumptions, bias, or ignorance." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. Everyone was listening. "There will be changes," she said simply. "Real ones. Because if this can happen to me, the CEO, then I can only imagine what happens to people who don't have the power to push back." The bank remained silent. Todd's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Miss Roberts?" "I don't want assurances," Hannah said coolly. "Show me." Todd's mouth snapped shut. Hannah glanced at her phone. The recording was still active. She stopped it and slipped the device back into her bag. "Corporate will be in touch," she said. "And Todd?" He stiffened. "You might want to start looking for a new job." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out the door. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, Hannah had already scheduled an emergency meeting with her corporate leadership team. Every branch manager was called in. Every customer service policy was reviewed. And Todd? He was gone. But Hannah didn't stop there. She implemented mandatory bias training across all branches, introduced a new accountability system, and encouraged customers to report any instances of discrimination, no matter how subtle. Within weeks, Robert's Trust saw a shift. Employees were more aware, and customers, especially those who had been ignored or brushed off in the past, began to notice the difference. And Hannah? She never forgot that day in the bank because it was proof of something she had always known. Real change doesn't happen because of words on a page. It happens because someone refuses to accept the way things are. And today, that someone was her. If you've ever been in a situation like this or know someone who has, don't stay silent, she said. Speak up, call it out, and most importantly, demand change. Because the only way things get better is when we refuse to accept anything less.